The photograph showed a woman with dark hair and uncertain eyes, standing stiffly against a plain backdrop. Her smile seemed practiced, hesitant. This single image, along with a few paragraphs describing her hobbies and dreams, was all Mason. Reed had to go on when he sent that first letter to Elena Sorokina. It was 1998, well before dating apps and video calls made long-distance relationships commonplace. Back then, international matchmaking services operated through catalogs and correspondence, earning them the controversial label of mail-order bride agencies. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Mason never imagined himself pursuing this route to find love. But at 42, after a decade of living alone in the small town of Pinecrest, Oregon, loneliness had become his most faithful companion. What he couldn't have known when he mailed that first letter was that Elena's journey to America would challenge everything his community thought they knew about love, resilience, and the quiet power of determination. The Greyhound bus pulled into Pinecrest's modest station at 7:43 p.m., 13 minutes late, according to the schedule clutched in Mason's sweaty palm. He stood on the platform, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, questioning for the 100th time if this whole arrangement had been a colossal mistake. His best friend Tom had certainly thought so. "You're bringing a complete stranger to live with you, someone who barely speaks English and is probably just looking for a green card," Tom had said over beers at O'Malley's pub last month. "You've lost your damn mind, Mason." Perhaps he had. But after 18 months of exchanging letters with Elena, letters that had grown increasingly personal and warm, Mason felt a connection he couldn't explain. Her handwriting, slanted and precise, filled pages with descriptions of her hometown outside of St. Petersburg, her work as an elementary school teacher, and her dreams of someday opening a small bookshop. She wrote about losing both parents within a year of each other and the struggle to support her younger brother through university. Her words were straightforward, never self-pitying, and occasionally laced with a dry humor that made Mason laugh out loud. The bus doors hissed open, and Mason stood straighter, smoothing down his freshly ironed button-down shirt. A few passengers disembarked, a teenage boy with headphones, an elderly couple helping each other down the steps, a woman with a small child. And then Elena appeared in the doorway, exactly as she looked in the photographs she'd sent, but somehow entirely different. She wore a navy blue dress with small white polka dots and clutched a worn leather suitcase. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing high cheekbones and eyes that surveyed her surroundings with cautious curiosity. When she spotted Mason, the smile that spread across her face transformed her entirely from the stiff pose in those catalog photos. "Mason," she said, her accent wrapping around his name in a way that made it sound new. "Elena," he replied, suddenly forgetting every Russian phrase he'd practiced. "Welcome to Pinecrest." The drive to Mason's house took 15 minutes, during which Elena sat perfectly straight, her suitcase balanced on her lap, despite Mason's assurance that it could go in the back seat. She looked out the window at the passing scenery, the small downtown with its hardware store, diner and post office, the neighborhoods of modest homes with well-kept yards, the mountains rising in the distance, still capped with snow despite it being late May. "It is beautiful here," she said, her voice soft but clear. "Very green." Mason nodded, gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. "Spring is nice. Winters can be tough, though. Lots of snow. Roads get bad sometimes." "In Russia, I know snow," Elena replied with the hint of a smile. "I am not afraid of winter." Mason's house sat on 3 acres at the edge of town, a 2-story craftsman he'd inherited from his uncle and spent years renovating. He'd prepared the guest bedroom for Elena, making it as comfortable as possible, with fresh linens, a small television, and a vase of wildflowers on the dresser. Their agreement, outlined clearly in their letters, was that she would stay as his guest for 3 months. During that time, they would get to know each other properly, face to face, before deciding if marriage was truly what they both wanted. "This is yours?" "All yours?" Elena asked as they pulled into the long driveway. "Yep, been in my family for generations. My uncle left it to me when he passed away about 12 years ago." Mason cut the engine and turned to face her. "I hope you'll be comfortable here." Something unreadable flickered across Elena's features. "It is more than comfortable. It is beautiful home." Inside, Mason showed her around. The living room with its stone fireplace, the updated kitchen, his workshop in the basement where he crafted custom furniture, a small side business that supplemented his income as the town's building inspector. Elena followed silently, taking everything in with those watchful eyes. When they reached the guest bedroom, she placed her suitcase carefully on the floor. "I have made dinner," Mason said. "Nothing fancy, just roast chicken and potatoes. But if you're too tired, I can save you a plate for tomorrow." Elena shook her head. "I would like to eat, please, and then maybe shower." It was a long journey. "In course, I'll let you settle in for a few minutes. Come down whenever you're ready." Alone in the kitchen, Mason poured himself a glass of water and drank it in one long gulp. Elena was here, actually here, in his house. The woman whose letters he'd read so many times that the paper had grown soft at the creases. She was smaller than he'd imagined, more reserved. But her eyes, there was something in them that the photographs hadn't captured. A sharpness, an intelligence that both intrigued and intimidated him. They ate dinner at the kitchen table, the conversation halting at first, but gradually finding a rhythm. Elena's English was better than Mason had expected, though she occasionally searched for words, her brow furrowing in concentration. "Tomorrow I can show you around town," Mason offered as they cleared the dishes together. "Not that there's much to see, but you should know where the grocery store is, the library, things like that." "Yes, I would like this." Elena carefully dried a plate and placed it in the cabinet where she'd seen Mason take them from. "And maybe you can tell me what jobs might be possible for me here. I do not want to—" She paused, searching for the phrase, "be burden." "You're not a burden, Elena. The agreement was that you'd stay here as my guest. You don't need to worry about money right now." A flash of something, pride perhaps, crossed her face. "I always work, since I was 16. "It is important to me." Mason nodded slowly, understanding. "We'll figure something out. There's a bookstore in town that might be hiring, and the elementary school sometimes needs teaching assistants." "Thank you." She folded the dish towel precisely. "I will now take a shower, if it is okay." "Of course. Towels are in the cabinet in the bathroom. Let me know if you need anything else." Later, lying in bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of another person moving about his house, Mason wondered what tomorrow would bring. The arrangement had seemed sensible in theory, a 3-month trial period to determine compatibility before making any permanent decisions. But now, with Elena actually here, the reality felt infinitely more complex. Morning brought rain, a gentle, spring shower that beaded on the windows and made the surrounding forest look like a watercolor painting. Mason woke early, as was his habit, and was surprised to find Eleanor already in the kitchen, a cup of tea in her hands. "I hope I did not wake you," she said. "In Russia, I always wake with the sun. No, this is my normal time." Mason headed for the coffee maker. "Did you sleep okay?" "Yes, very good bed, very quiet here. In St. Petersburg, always noise outside my window." They drove into town after breakfast, Mason pointing out the essential landmarks: the grocery store, the medical clinic, the bank. Pinecrest's main street was only 4 blocks long. The buildings a mix of early 1900s architecture and more modern establishments. People turned to look at them as they walked, curiosity evident in their expressions. In a town of just over 3,000 residents, a newcomer was noteworthy, especially one as striking as Elena. Mason Reed, "As I Live and Breathe," the booming voice belonged to Dorothy Parker, the 70-year-old owner of the Pinecrest Diner. She stood in the doorway of her establishment, arms crossed over her ample bosom. "You bringing your special guest for breakfast?" News traveled fast in Pinecrest. Mason had mentioned to only a few people that Elena was arriving, but apparently the whole town now knew. "Morning, Dorothy. This is Elena Sorokina. Elena, this is Dorothy Parker, best cook in 3 counties. Dorothy's eyes raked over Elena, making no attempt to hide her assessment. "Russian, aren't you? Mason mentioned that. Well, come on in. You must be hungry after your long trip." The diner was half full, mostly with the morning regulars, retirees having their daily coffee, a few workers grabbing breakfast before heading to the lumber mill outside town. Conversation dimmed noticeably when Mason and Elena entered, then resumed at a slightly lower volume, punctuated by glances in their direction. They slid into a booth by the window, and Dorothy brought over menus. "And coffee without being asked. Specials blueberry pancakes today, made with local berries I froze last summer." "That sounds perfect," Mason said. "Elena?" "Yes, I would like to try American pancakes," she said, her accent more pronounced under the scrutiny of so many strangers. Dorothy walked away. Mason noticed the Hendersons at a nearby table whispering to each other while staring openly at Eleanor. Greta Henderson caught his eye and quickly looked away, but not before Mason saw the disapproval on her face. "People here are not used to strangers," Elena asked quietly, clearly aware of the attention. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Mason sighed. "Not really, and they've never been subtle. I'm sorry about this. It'll die down once they get used to you." But the scrutiny didn't end at the diner. At the grocery store, the clerk asked Elena loudly and slowly if she needed help finding anything, as if volume would bridge any language gap. At the bookstore, the owner, Meredith Wilson, barely acknowledged Elena's interest in potential job openings, saying curtly that they weren't hiring at this time, despite the help wanted sign in the window. By early afternoon, Mason could see the strain on Elena's face, though she maintained a polite expression. "Maybe that's enough for today," he suggested. "We can head back home if you'd like." Elena nodded, relief evident in the slight relaxation of her shoulders. As they walked back to the truck, they passed Tom coming out of the hardware store. Mason raised a hand in greeting, but Tom's response was lukewarm at best, his eyes flicking to Elena with unconcealed suspicion. "Friend of yours?" Elena asked once they were in the truck. "My best friend, actually. Or he has been since 3rd grade. Mason started the engine with more force than necessary. "He's just protective. He thinks I am here for a green card," Elena stated matter-of-factly. "Or for your money." Mason glanced at her, surprised by her directness. "I don't have any money to speak of, so that would be a poor strategy on your part." For the first time that day, Elena laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face. "This is true, I'm a terrible gold digger." That evening, Eleanor insisted on cooking dinner, creating a simple but delicious meal of chicken cutlets with mushrooms and a side of buckwheat that she'd found at the grocery store. "Not exactly like home, but close," she explained as they ate. Mason took a bite and nodded appreciatively. "It's great. You didn't mention you were such a good cook in your letters." There are many things we do not know about each other yet, Elena replied, her eyes meeting his briefly before returning to her plate. Letters are only words on paper. The next few days fell into an uneasy pattern. Elena spent mornings exploring the property around Mason's house, often returning with wildflowers or interesting stones she'd found. In the afternoons, she studied English from books Mason had borrowed from the library, making meticulous notes in a small journal. Mason continued his work as the building inspector, returning home each evening to find dinner prepared and Elena waiting with careful questions about his day. On Friday evening, Mason suggested they attend the weekly community movie night in the town square. They set up a big screen in the park. This week is some action film with Bruce Willis. Nothing amazing, but it might be fun to get out. Eleanor agreed, though Mason sensed her apprehension about facing the townspeople again. She dressed carefully in jeans and a simple blouse, pulling her hair back and applying just a touch of lipstick. Mason found himself staring at her as she came down the stairs, struck by how at ease she looked in his home after less than a week. The town square was crowded when they arrived, families spread out on blankets, couples in lawn chairs. Mason led Elena to a spot at the edge of the gathering, hoping to minimize unwanted attention. He'd brought a blanket and a small cooler with drinks and snacks. "This is a nice tradition," Elena said as they settled on the blanket. "In my town, nothing like this." "It's been going on since I was a kid," Mason replied. "Used to be at the drive-in theater outside town, but that closed down about 15 years ago." They were interrupted by Greta Henderson, who approached with her husband Ray in tow. Greta's smile was tight, her eyes cold as they rested on Elena. "Mason, how lovely to see you out and about," she said, pointedly ignoring Elena. "We missed you at the town council meeting on Tuesday." "Had a building inspection out at Murphy Place," Mason explained. "Greta, Ray, this is Elena Sorokina." "Elena, these are the Hendersons. Ray owns the hardware store." Elena extended her hand. "Nice to meet you." Greta barely touched Elena's fingers before withdrawing her hand. "Yes, well, everyone's been talking about Mason's guest." Her emphasis on the last word made its meaning clear. "I believe the word you are looking for is fiancé," Eleanor said calmly, her accent more pronounced but her voice steady. "Though we are still getting to know each other properly." Ray Henderson had the decency to look embarrassed by his wife's behavior. "Good to meet you, Elena. Don't mind Greta. She's just protective of our little community." "Of course," Elena replied with dignity. "It is good to be protective of things you love." After the Hendersons moved away, Mason looked at Elena with new respect. "You handled that well. Better than I would have." Elena shrugged slightly. "In Russia, I teach children. Parents can be much worse than Mrs. Henderson when they think their child deserves a better grade." The movie began, but Mason found it hard to concentrate. He was acutely aware of Elena beside him, of the occasional glances and whispers from nearby townspeople. Halfway through the film, he felt Elena's hand slip into his, a small gesture of connection that sent his heart racing like a teenager's. When they returned home that night, something had shifted between them. The awkwardness of the past days had been replaced by a tentative alliance. They were in this together now, facing the town's judgment as a unit rather than as individuals. The following Wednesday, Mason came home to find Eleanor sitting at the kitchen table, tears streaming silently down her face. She quickly wiped them away when she heard him enter, but not before he'd seen. "What happened?" he asked, setting down his toolbox and crossing to her side. For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, her voice low, she said, "I went to the library today to practice English and look for job postings." She paused, composing herself. "The librarian, Mrs. Wilson. She asked why I did not go back to Russia. Said women like me are disgraceful." Anger flared in Mason's chest. Meredith Wilson said that to you? Elena nodded, her eyes downcast. She said I am, what is the word? Gold digger. Said you are a fool to bring a stranger into your home. A bitter smile touched her lips. Said no American woman would want you. That is why you had to send it away for your wife. Mason sat heavily in the chair across from her, shame and rage battling for dominance. Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Meredith had no right to say those things. To you. Is it true? Elena looked up at him then, her gaze direct. You could not find an American wife? The question caught him off guard with its bluntness. It's not. I didn't. He stopped, took a breath. I was married once, a long time ago. Sarah, we were high school sweethearts. She died in a car accident when we were 26. Elena's expression softened. I am sorry. After that, I just couldn't seem to connect with anyone. Tried dating over the years, but nothing ever felt right. This town, everyone here knew me as half of Mason and Sarah since we were 16 years old. Every woman I dated was compared to her, by the town, and if I'm honest, by me too. And so you looked elsewhere, Mason nodded slowly. I saw an ad for the international matchmaking service in a magazine at the barber shop. It seemed, I don't know, like a fresh start. Someone who didn't know my history, who wouldn't be competing with a ghost. I understand this, Eleanor said, softly. After my parents died, my hometown felt like a coat that no longer fits. Every street, every building, a reminder of what I lost. They sat in silence for a moment, the shared understanding hanging between them. Tomorrow, I'm going to have a word with Meredith Wilson, Mason finally said. What she did was completely out of line. Elena shook her head firmly. No, this will only make things worse. I do not need you to fight my battles, Mason. But in Russia, we have a saying, the quietest duck gets the deepest root. I will show them who I am through actions, not words. Despite his frustration, Mason respected her wish. The next day, Elena returned to the library, ignoring Meredith Wilson's cold stare, and spent 3 hours helping an elderly man named Frank Miller learn how to use the computer to email his grandchildren. When she left, Frank told Meredith loudly that Mason Reed's Russian lady was the most patient teacher he'd ever had. By the end of the second week, small changes began to appear in their dynamic. Elena no longer asked permission to use the kitchen or the washing machine. She rearranged the spice rack in a way that made more sense to her, and Mason found he preferred her organization system. One evening, he came home to find her in his workshop, examining his tools with genuine interest. "You make beautiful things," she said, running her fingers along the edge of a half-finished bookcase. "In your letters, you did not say you are an artist." Mason felt warmth spread through his chest at her praise. "I wouldn't call myself an artist, just like working with my hands." "This is art," she insisted, gesturing to a cherrywood table in the corner that he'd completed last month. "To take a tree and make something so beautiful, this is gift." That night, they talked for hours at the kitchen table, sharing stories they hadn't included in their letters. Elena told him about her brother Mikhail, now a software engineer in Moscow, and how she'd worked 3 jobs to put him through university after their parents died. Mason described growing up in Pinecrest, his dreams of becoming an architect that had been set aside after Sarah's death when the thought of leaving his hometown became unbearable. As May turned to June, Elena's presence in Mason's life began to feel less like an arrangement and more like a partnership. She found a part-time job at the local nursery, tending to plants and helping customers despite the lingering suspicion she encountered from some townspeople. Her English improved daily, and with it, her confidence. At home, they developed routines. Coffee, together in the mornings, dinner at the kitchen table each night, occasional movies on the old VCR in the living room. And yet, there remained a careful distance between them, an unspoken boundary. They were still technically in their trial period, still evaluating whether this arrangement could or should become permanent. Mason found himself thinking about Elena throughout his workday, noticing things he wanted to tell her, planning projects they could do together around the house. But he held back, uncertain of her feelings, aware of the unusual circumstances that had brought them together. On a warm Saturday in mid-June, Mason suggested they drive to Crater Lake for the day. It's about 2 hours from here, but worth the trip. One of the most beautiful places in Oregon. Elena agreed enthusiastically, packing a lunch while Mason loaded the truck. The drive took them through winding mountain roads, the scenery growing more dramatic with each mile. Elena leaned forward in her seat as they approached the rim of the crater, her eyes widening at the sight of the impossibly blue water below. "It is like fairy tale," she breathed as they stood at the lookout point. "How can water be so blue?" "It's the depth and purity," Mason explained, pleased by her reaction. "It's the deepest lake in the United States, almost 2,000 feet deep in some places." They hiked along the rim trail, stopping often to take in the views. Elena seemed more relaxed away from Pinecrest, laughing more freely, asking questions about the wildlife and geology of the area. During lunch at a picnic area, she told Mason stories about her childhood trips to the Black Sea with her parents, her expression animated in a way he hadn't seen before. "You miss Russia?" he asked, as they watched an osprey circle over the lake. Elena considered the question seriously. "I miss certain things, the smell of my mother's kitchen, the sound of church bells on Sunday morning. My brother's laugh." She turned to face Mason. "But I do not miss feeling trapped. In Russia, after my parents died, I felt like a bird in cage. Here, even with difficulties, I can breathe." On the drive home, Elena fell asleep, her head resting against the window. Mason glanced at her occasionally, struck by the peaceful expression on her face. Something had shifted between them during their day at the lake, a new ease that felt promising. As they pulled into Pinecrest, however, reality intruded in the form of Tom's truck parked in Mason's driveway. Eleanor woke as they came to a stop, immediately alert. "Your friend is here," she observed, straightening in her seat and smoothing her hair. Tom stood on the porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. He'd avoided Mason since Elena's arrival, their usual Friday night beer at O'Malley's, abandoned without explanation. Mason felt a mixture of annoyance and relief at his friend's presence. "Mason," Tom nodded curtly as they approached. "Elena." "Tom," Mason returned. "What brings you by?" "Thought it was time we talked. Sarah's parents are in town. They're asking questions about the situation." Tom's eyes flicked to Eleanor and back to Mason. Eleanor touched Mason's arm lightly. "I will go inside. Give you privacy." "No," Mason said firmly, covering her hand with his own. "Whatever Tom has to say, he can say in front of both of us." Tom's jaw tightened. "Fine. The Andersons heard you brought a mail-order bride to town. They're upset. Say it's disrespectful to Sarah's memory." "Disrespectful?" Mason's voice rose. "It's been 16 years, Tom. 16 years since Sarah died. Am I supposed to spend the rest of my life alone?" "Of course not. But this?" Tom gestured toward Elena. "Ordering a wife from a catalogue? What would Sarah think?" "I was not ordered from the catalogue," Elena interjected, her voice quiet but firm. "I made a choice to come here, to meet Mason in person. We are adults, making adult decisions." Tom ignored her, focusing on Mason. "You don't know anything about her, where she comes from, what she's running from. The whole town's talking, Mason." "Let them talk." Mason's anger was building. "I don't answer to the town, and I certainly don't answer to you, Tom." "The Andersons want to see you," Tom continued. "They're staying at the Pine View Motel through Tuesday. They deserve that much, at least." Mason felt the weight of obligation settle on his shoulders. The Andersons had been like second parents to him, especially in the years following Sarah's death. They had never pressured him to move on, had supported his decision to stay in Pinecrest even when opportunities arose elsewhere. "Fine. I'll go. And see them tomorrow," he conceded. "But my relationship with Elena is not up for discussion, with them or with you." Tom's expression hardened. "Just be careful, Mason. You've always been too trusting for your own good." With a final glance at Elena, he turned and walked to his truck. As the dust from Tom's departure settled, Mason and Elena stood in silence on the porch. The perfect day at Crater Lake seemed very far away now. "I will make tea," Elena finally said, moving toward the door. "We both need, I think." Inside, as the kettle boiled, Mason leaned against the counter, watching Elena's precise movements as she prepared the tea. "I'm sorry about Tom," he said. "And about all of this." Elena handed him a steaming mug. "You have nothing to apologize for. Your friend cares for you in his way. And these Andersons, they were family to you and Sarah?" "As good as. They never had other children. After Sarah died, they wanted me to move to Portland to be near them. But I couldn't leave this place. Too many memories, I guess." "Good memories are precious," Elena said thoughtfully, "even when they bring pain with them." Mason studied her face, the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength in her bearing. At that moment, he realized with startling clarity that he didn't want her to leave when the 3 months were up. The thought of returning to his solitary existence after knowing her presence in his home, in his life, was suddenly unbearable. But before he could find the words to express this revelation, Elena spoke again, her voice hesitant. "Tomorrow, when you see Sarah's parents, will you go alone?" Mason nodded. "I think that would be best for now. They're good people, but it might be too much all at once." "I understand," Elena said, though something in her expression suggested otherwise. "Some ghosts we must face alone." The Pineview Motel sat on the outskirts of Pinecrest, a single-story building with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. Mason parked his truck in the near-empty lot, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before approaching room 12, where the Andersons were staying. He hadn't seen them in person for nearly 4 years, though they exchanged Christmas cards and occasional phone calls. He knocked on the door, heart hammering against his ribs. Barbara Anderson answered, her face lighting up at the sight of him. She was smaller than he remembered, her once auburn hair now completely grey, but her eyes, so like Sarah's, were just as warm. "Mason," she pulled him into a tight embrace. "Oh, it's so good to see you." Robert Anderson appeared behind his wife, extending a hand that turned into a hug. "You're looking well, son. Come in, come in." The motel room was neat but sparse. 2 double beds, a small table by the window, a television on a wooden stand. Barbara had placed family photos on the dresser, including one of Sarah in her high school graduation gown, her smile bright and carefree. "Sit, please," Barbara gestured to the chairs around the small table. "We've brought some of that apple butter you always liked, and photos of the new house. We finally downsized last year, moved to a condo downtown." For 20 minutes, they engaged in careful small talk, Mason asking about their health, the Andersons, inquiring about his work, the furniture business, the unusually warm spring. The elephant in the room grew larger with each passing minute. Finally, Robert cleared his throat. "Tom tells us you've met someone." Mason nodded, meeting the older man's gaze directly. "Her name is Elena Sorokina. She's from Russia. She's been staying with me for about 3 weeks now." Barbara's hands twisted in her lap. "Tom said something about a mail-order bride service? Surely that can't be right, Mason." Mason sighed, wishing he'd prepared better for this conversation. "It's an international matchmaking agency. We exchanged letters for over a year before she came here. We're getting to know each other properly now." "Letters?" Robert's tone was incredulous. Mason, in this day and age, there are dating websites, singles groups, normal ways to meet people. I tried those, Mason said quietly. Nothing ever clicked. And this town, everyone here has known me since I was born. Everyone here knew Sarah and me together. Barbara reached across the table and took his hand. We want you to be happy, Mason. You know that. Sarah would want that too. Then trust me to know what I'm doing. Elena is... Mason searched for the right words. She's remarkable, strong, intelligent. She's faced a lot in her life and handled it with grace. But you don't really know her, Robert insisted. Where she comes from, her family, her past. These services prey on lonely men, women looking for green cards, financial security. Mason pulled his hand away, frustration rising. That's exactly what Tom said, and half the town, apparently. None of you have bothered to get to know her. You've already decided who she is, based on how we met. We're concerned, that's all, Barbara said softly. It seems so unlike you. Mason, you've always been cautious, thoughtful. I am being cautious. That's why she's here for 3 months before we make any decisions about marriage. We're taking our time, doing this right. Robert leaned forward, his expression earnest. Son, we've always considered you family, even after Sarah was gone. We just don't want to see you taken advantage of. I appreciate the concern, really, but I need you to trust my judgment here. Mason stood, suddenly needing fresh air. I'd like you to meet her before you leave town. Come to dinner tomorrow night. See for yourself who she is. The Andersons exchanged a look, a silent communication built on decades of marriage. Finally, Barbara nodded. We'd like that, Mason. Back in his truck, Mason sat motionless, replaying the conversation. The Andersons' concern was genuine. He knew that, but underlying their words was an assumption that he couldn't possibly have found something real with Elena, that their connection must be based on deception or desperation. When he arrived home, he found Elena in the garden behind the house, kneeling in the dirt as she planted seedlings in neat rows. She'd taken to gardening with unexpected enthusiasm, spending hours researching which vegetables would grow best in Oregon's climate and soil. The Andersons are coming for dinner tomorrow night, Mason announced without preamble. Elena looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. A smudge of dirt marked her cheek, and Mason resisted the urge to wipe it away. This is good, she said after a moment. I will make a special meal. In Russia, we have tradition. First meeting with family, we make a feast to show respect. There, not my family, Mason corrected automatically, then stopped. Well, they sort of are, I guess. They were going to be my in-laws. Elena stood, brushing soil from her hands. Then, more important, I make a good impression. I will need to go to the store for ingredients. You don't have to go to all that trouble, Elena. Is no trouble. She looked at him with quiet determination. These people matter to you, so they matter to me. That evening they drove to the grocery store together, Elena making a list with careful precision. She selected ingredients with a discerning eye, fresh herbs, a plump chicken, vegetables for a salad, cream for a dessert she described as like your cheesecake, but lighter. At the checkout, they encountered Greta Henderson again, her cart full of items for the church bake sale. Her smile tightened when she saw them. Mason, hello. And Elena, isn't it? Greta's voice dripped with false sweetness. Settling in, are you? Must be quite an adjustment from wherever it is you're from. St. Petersburg, Elena replied calmly. Yes, many adjustments, but people in small towns are same everywhere, I think. Some kind, some not so kind. Greta's smile faltered. Well, I'm sure you'll find Pinecrest very educational, though I can't imagine you'll stay long. These arrangements rarely work out, I'm told. Mason opened his mouth to respond, but Elena placed a hand on his arm. Time will tell, Mrs. Henderson, but I think maybe you should not believe everything you are told. Elena's tone remained pleasant, but there was steel beneath it. Small minds like small gossip, my grandmother always said. As they walked to the truck, Mason glanced at Elena with newfound respect. You handled that well. Elena shrugged slightly. Women like Mrs. Henderson exist everywhere. In Russia, we say, the empty barrel makes the most noise. The next day passed in a flurry of preparation. Eleanor woke early to clean the house, not that it needed cleaning, but Mason understood the key. Impulse. She wanted everything to be perfect for this important meeting. By afternoon, delicious smells filled the kitchen as she prepared a meal that seemed to involve multiple courses and techniques Mason had never seen before. What can I do to help? He asked, feeling useless as she moved efficiently around his kitchen. Set table, nice way, she instructed, and maybe put flowers. I saw wild ones in my driveway yesterday, very pretty. He gathered a bouquet of wildflowers, arranging them in his mother's old crystal vase that he rarely used. As he set the dining room table with his best dishes, another thing that rarely saw the light of day, he was struck by how different his home felt with Elena in it, more alive somehow, filled with purpose. The Andersons arrived at 6 o'clock sharp, bringing a bottle of wine and obvious apprehension. Mason made introductions on the porch, watching as Elena greeted them with gracious formality, thanking them for coming and complimenting Barbara's necklace, a delicate gold pendant that had been a gift from Sarah many years ago. Inside, Mason poured wine while Elena put the finishing touches on the first course, a cold soup she called okroshka, made with vegetables, eggs and herbs in a tangy base. The conversation was stilted at first, with Robert asking overly careful questions about Elena's hometown and Barbara making polite observations about the weather. Gradually, as the meal progressed to the main course, a chicken dish with mushrooms, that Elena called chicken à la Kiev, but my mother's special recipe, the atmosphere began to thaw. Elena asked the Andersons thoughtful questions about their lives in Portland, their hobbies, their grandchildren from Robert's side of the family. She listened intently to their answers, asking follow-up questions that showed genuine interest. When Barbara mentioned her volunteer work teaching English to immigrants, Elena's face lit up. This is wonderful work. My English teacher in Russia, Mrs. Petrova, she changed my life, give me books, encourage me to dream beyond my small town. Your English is quite good, Barbara acknowledged, seeming surprised by this. Where did you learn? School, of course, but mostly books, American films. I teach elementary school in Russia, so it is important to have good language skills. Eleanor served the dessert she'd prepared, a light, airy confection topped with fresh berries. In the classroom, 28 children all talking at once. You must think quickly in any language. By the time coffee was served, Robert had relaxed enough to share stories about Sarah as a child. Her determination to learn to ride a bicycle without training wheels, her science fair project gone hilariously wrong. Mason had heard these stories before, but watching Elena's attentive reactions to them, her respectful questions, he saw Sarah's parents responding to her quiet warmth, despite themselves. Mason tells us you're working at Blackwell's nursery now, Barbara said as the evening wound down. Do you enjoy gardening? Elena nodded. In Russia, my grandmother had small garden, vital during Soviet times when stores had little food. She taught me everything. Which plants need sun, which need shade, how to save seeds for next year. Barbara's quite the gardener herself, Robert said, patting his wife's hand. She wins prizes at the Portland Garden Club every year for her roses. What followed was an animated discussion of gardening techniques, with Barbara offering advice about Oregon's growing season, and Elena sharing Russian folk wisdom about companion planting. Mason and Robert exchanged amused glances over their coffee cups as the women's conversation grew increasingly technical. When the Andersons finally stood to leave, Barbara surprised everyone by pulling Elena into a brief hug. "Thank you for dinner. It was lovely. You are welcome in this home any time," Elena replied, the formal phrase carrying genuine sincerity. After they left, Mason and Elena cleaned the kitchen in comfortable silence. Finally, as they dried the last of the dishes, Mason spoke. "That went better than I expected." Elena smiled, a tired but satisfied expression. "They are good people who love you. Of course they worry." "What did Barbara say to you at the door?" "I saw her whisper something." Eleanor folded the dish towel carefully. "She said I should come visit her garden in Portland someday, and that she has books about Russian literature she thinks I would enjoy." Something tight in Mason's chest eased at these words. It wasn't approved exactly, but it was a beginning. The following day, the Andersons stopped by the house before leaving town. They brought a gardening book for Eleanor and a carved wooden box for Mason that had belonged to Robert's father. "We've been holding on to this for years," Robert explained as Mason ran his fingers over the intricate pattern. "Thought you might use it in your furniture making somehow, for inspiration." The goodbye was warmer than Mason had dared hope, with promises to visit Portland soon and invitations for the Andersons to return to Pinecrest. As June turned to July, Elena's place in Mason's life grew more established. The routine they'd developed, morning coffee, work during the day, dinner together in the evening, took on the comfortable rhythm of permanence. Elena expanded the vegetable garden, started an herb patch near the kitchen, and filled the house with small touches that reflected her presence: embroidered cushions, hand-woven baskets for storage, bookshelves organized by a system that made sense to her. At the nursery, her knowledge of plants and patient manner with customers gradually won respect, if not friendship, from her colleagues. The owner, Jack Blackwell, an older man with little patience for town gossip, appreciated her work ethic and expanded her hours. Mason found himself looking forward to coming home each day, to hearing about Elena's small triumphs and challenges, to sharing his own. They still maintained separate bedrooms, the unspoken agreement of their arrangement holding firm despite the growing warmth between them. But sometimes, watching Elena read by lamplight in the evening or tend to her garden in the early morning sun, Mason felt a longing so intense it almost took his breath away. One evening in mid-July, Mason returned home to find Elena sitting on the porch steps, a letter in her hands, her expression troubled. "What's wrong?" he asked, settling beside her. She handed him the letter silently. It was from her brother Mikhail, written in Russian with an English translation on separate pages. Mason skimmed the translation, understanding dawning as he read. "He's been offered a job in Canada," he said. "He wants you to join him there." Elena nodded, her eyes on the distant mountains. "Toronto, good position with a software company, apartment big enough for both of us." She turned to Mason, her expression unreadable. "He worries about me here." "What did you tell him?" Mason asked, his heart suddenly pounding. "I have not answered yet." She took the letter back, folding it carefully. Many things to consider. That night, Mason lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the possibility of Elena leaving, cutting through him like a physical pain. Their 3-month agreement had almost reached its midpoint. Soon they would need to decide whether to move forward with marriage or part ways. The letter from Mikhail added a new dimension to that choice. Another option, another path Elena could take. The next morning, Mason found Elena at the kitchen table, coffee already made, her expression suggesting she'd slept as poorly as he had. "I need to ask you something," he said, sitting across from her. "And I need you to be completely honest." She met his gaze steadily. "I am always honest, Mason. Are you happy here? Not just tolerated or making the best of things, but actually happy?" Elena considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. Happiness is a complicated word. In Russia, we do not expect life to be happy all the time. We expect it to have meaning, purpose. She paused, sipping her coffee. "Here, with you, I find meaning, work I enjoy, home that feels safe, person who respects me." A slight smile touched her lips. "So, yes, by Russian standards, very happy." Relief flooded through Mason, followed quickly by determination. "Don't answer your brother yet. Let me show you something first." That weekend, Mason took Elena to Bandon, a small coastal town about 3 hours from Pinecrest. They stayed at a bed and breakfast overlooking the ocean, spent hours walking along the beach, collecting agates and watching seabirds, ate fresh seafood at local restaurants. Away from Pinecrest, away from the scrutiny and expectations, they talked more freely about their hopes, their fears, their pasts. On their last evening, as they walked along the shoreline at sunset, Mason gathered his courage. "I know we still have a month left in our agreement," he began, his voice nearly lost in the sound of the waves. "But I don't need that long to know what I want." Elena stopped walking, turning to face him fully, the dying sunlight casting a golden glow on her features. "I want you to stay, Elena. Not because of our arrangement, not because it's convenient or practical, but because these past weeks have been the happiest I've had in years, because I think we could build something real together." For a long moment, Elena was silent, the waves lapping at their feet, the wind tugging at her hair. Then she reached up, touching Mason's face with gentle fingers. "In Russia, we have saying, 'The heart is not a stone to be thrown, but a flower to be tended.'" Her eyes searched for him. "I came here looking for a new beginning, not knowing if I would find it. But with you, Mason Reed, I have found more than a new beginning. I have found home." When they returned to Pinecrest the next day, something fundamental had shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained dissolved, replaced by a new certainty. Elena moved her few belongings into Mason's bedroom, and they began discussing plans for making their arrangement permanent, the necessary paperwork for a fiancé visa, the legal requirements, the timeline. Word spread quickly through town, as it always did. Some reactions were supportive. Jack Blackwell offered Elena a permanent position at the nursery. Dorothy from the diner brought over a homemade pie for the happy couple. Frank Miller from the library told anyone who would listen that Mason Reed finally got some sense in his head. Others were less accepting. Greta Henderson made pointed remarks at church about the sanctity of traditional marriage, and some of Mason's longtime acquaintances seemed uncomfortable around the newly acknowledged couple. Tom remained distant, though Mason had reached out several times, leaving messages that went unreturned. The silence from his oldest friend stung, but Mason refused to let it overshadow his happiness with Elena. 3 weeks after their return from the coast, Mason was at work when he received an urgent call from Jack Blackwell. "You need to come to the nursery right away," the older man said, his voice tight with anger. "There's been an incident." Mason broke every speed limit driving across town, fear clutching at his throat. He found Elena sitting in Jack's office, her face pale but composed. Jack stood nearby, practically vibrating with rage. "Tell him what happened," Jack urged Elena. Elena looked up at Mason, her expression carefully controlled. "Mrs. Henderson came to the nursery with friends from church. They wanted to talk to me about my situation. Say they were concerned for my soul." Her accent was more pronounced, as it tended to be when she was upset. Oh, when I tell them politely that my soul is not their business, Mrs. Henderson became very angry. She said, Elena hesitated. Tell him exactly what she said, Jack insisted. Elena's eyes met Mason's. She said the whole town knows the truth about me, that I am whore from Russia who tricked a lonely man for a green card, that no real Christian would recognize such an arrangement as marriage. Eleanor's voice remained steady, but Mason saw the hurt beneath her composure. When I did not react, she knocked over the display of orchids I was arranging. Very expensive plants, many broken. I threw them out, Jack added. Told them I'd call the sheriff if they ever set foot in my business again. Mason knelt beside Elena's chair, taking her hands in his. I'm so sorry. You shouldn't have to deal with this kind of hatred. It's not your fault, Elena said firmly. Mrs. Henderson does not speak for the whole town. No, she doesn't, Jack agreed. And I made sure she knows it. Half the customers in the shop told her off before I even got over there. That evening, as word of the incident spread, their phone began ringing. Dorothy from the diner called to express her outrage. Frank Miller offered to organize a town meeting to address this kind of behavior. Even Meredith Wilson from the library, who had been cool to Elena from the beginning, called to say that Greta Henderson's actions were completely unacceptable, and that Elena was welcome at the library any time. Most surprisingly, Tom's truck pulled into their driveway just after dinner. He sat awkwardly at the kitchen table while Elena made coffee, his eyes taking in the changes to the house. The embroidered curtains, the thriving plants on the windowsill, the organized spice rack. I heard about what happened at the nursery, he said finally. It's not right what Great did. No, it's not, Mason agreed, waiting for more. Tom shifted uncomfortably. Look, I've been a jerk. I was worried about you, but that's no excuse for how I've acted. He turned to Elena. I didn't give you a chance. I made assumptions based on, well, how you two met. That wasn't fair. Elena set a cup of coffee in front of him. In Russia, we say, judge not by the cover, but by what's inside the book. You were protecting your friend. This I understand. Still, Tom looked genuinely remorseful. I'm sorry, to both of you. As Tom left that night, he hugged Mason briefly. You seem happy, man. Happier than I've seen you in years. I am, Mason confirmed, watching as his friend drove away. Inside, Eleanor was loading the dishwasher, a thoughtful expression on her face. What are you thinking about? Mason asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. She leaned back against him slightly. Today was difficult, but also revealing. Sometimes you do not know who your friends are until trouble comes. Mason nodded, understanding what she meant. The incident at the nursery, ugly as it was, had clarified who in Pinecrest accepted their relationship and who did not, and the balance had tipped decidedly in their favor. I've been thinking, Mason said, turning Elena to face him. Let's not wait any longer. Let's get married next month before your visitor visa expires. Nothing fancy, just us and a few friends. Then we can start the permanent residency paperwork right away. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly. You sure? No more doubts? No doubts, Mason affirmed. Not a single one. The smile that bloomed across Elena's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, gradual, then all at once brilliant. Then yes, next month we will marry. Later that night, as they lay together in what was now truly their bedroom, Elena propped herself up on one elbow, studying Mason's face in the moonlight streaming through the window. I need to tell you something, she said softly. About why I really came to America. Mason waited, giving her the space to continue. My brother, Mikhail, the letter he sent, this was not the first time he offered me a place to live with him. He asked many times over the years. She paused, gathering her thoughts. In Russia, after our parents died, I put my life on hold. Everything was for Mikhail, his education, his future. When he finished university, got a good job he wanted. To help me the same way. That's understandable, Mason said. He loves you. Yes, but I did not want to be burden to him. To trade one kind of obligation for another. Her fingers traced patterns on Mason's chest. When I saw an advertisement for a matchmaking service, I thought maybe this is a way to make my own path. Not Mikhail's sister, not daughter caring for parents who are gone, but just Elena. Person with own life. Mason covered her hand with his. And has it worked? Have you found your own path? In the silvery darkness, Elena's smile was luminous. I think maybe I have found my own path and also someone to walk it with me. This is a gift I did not expect. They lay in silence for a while, the night wrapping around them like a blanket. Mason found himself thinking about the strange, unlikely sequence of events that had brought them together. A matchmaking service advertisement in a barbershop magazine, letters crossing oceans, a brave woman traveling to a strange country, to meet a man she knew only through words on paper. "What are you thinking now?" Eleanor asked, noticing his expression. "I'm thinking that sometimes the most unconventional beginnings lead to the most perfect endings," Mason replied, pulling her closer, "and that I'm very lucky you saw something worth pursuing in my letters." "We are both lucky," Elena murmured, her voice growing sleepy. "Some journeys are worth every difficult step." As Elena's breathing deepened into sleep, Mason remained awake, watching the moonlight move across the ceiling, listening to the occasional owl call from the woods behind the house. The home that had once felt too empty, too full of memories, now hummed with present life and future possibilities. Outside, Eleanor's garden waited for morning sun, the seedlings she'd planted taking root in Oregon soil, growing stronger each day. In a town that had once seemed frozen in time, change had arrived in the form of a woman with watchful eyes and quiet determination. A woman who had crossed an ocean in search of a new beginning, and instead found a place where she truly belonged. A woman whose silence had concealed not emptiness, but a fire that warmed every corner of Mason's life. And for the first time in 16 years, Mason fell asleep without feeling the weight of the past pressing down on him. Tonight, his dreams turned toward the future, a future shaped by hands both his and not his, a path walked together with a partner he'd found in the most unexpected of ways. August arrived with a heat wave that baked the Oregon countryside. The mountains shimmered in the distance as Mason and Elena prepared for their wedding, scheduled for the 27th, a simple ceremony at the county courthouse, followed by a small reception at their home. Elena worked in the garden early, each morning before the sun grew too fierce, harvesting tomatoes and zucchini, tending to the herbs that now thrived along the kitchen windowsill. In the cool of the evening, they sat on the porch swing Mason had built, discussing their future in quiet voices as fireflies blinked in the gathering darkness. "Jack offered me a position as assistant manager," Elena mentioned one such evening, accepting a glass of iced tea from Mason. "Starting next month, more responsibility, better pay." Mason smiled, settling beside her on the swing. "That's fantastic. I knew he was impressed with your work. He wants me to develop a program for school children, teaching about plants, sustainable gardening." Her eyes lit with enthusiasm. "Could partner with the library, maybe start a community, a garden in an empty lot behind the church." In these moments, Mason caught glimpses of the educator Eleanor had been in Russia, passionate, full of ideas, her natural role as a teacher emerging despite the language and cultural barriers she'd faced. "The children would love that," he said, imagining Pinecrest's elementary students learning from Elena's patient instruction. "And it would be good for the town." Elena nodded thoughtfully. Community gardens are very important in Russia during hard times, bring people together, share knowledge, share food. She took a sip of tea. Children learn more than just gardening. They learn cooperation, patience, cycles of life. As she spoke, Mason felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. This was what had drawn him to her from the beginning. Her resilience, her ability to see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. Even in the face of Greta Henderson's prejudice, Elena had never surrendered her dignity or her determination to build a life in Pinecrest. The wedding plans remained deliberately simple. Elena had ordered a dress online, knee-length ivory lace with cap sleeves. Mason would wear the charcoal suit he'd purchased for his cousin's wedding 3 years earlier. They'd invited only their closest supporters: Jack Blackwell, Dorothy from the diner, Frank Miller from the library, and Tom, who had fully embraced his role as best man after his apology. To Mason's surprise, Barbara Anderson had called to say that she and Robert would attend if the invitation remained open. "We want to see you happy, Mason," she'd said, her voice crackling over the phone line. "And Elena, well, she's quite something, isn't she?" The night before the wedding, Mason found Elena at the kitchen table, writing a letter to her brother Mikhail. He'd sent a gift, a traditional Russian wedding decoration hand-carried by a colleague who'd traveled to Seattle for a conference, along with regrets that he couldn't attend himself. "Will he ever visit us here?" Mason asked, setting a cup of chamomile tea beside her. Elena looked up from her letter. "Yes, I think so. Once we are settled, perhaps for Christmas. He's curious about American traditions, about my new home," she smiled. "About you. What have you told him about me? That you are a kind man, patient, that you build beautiful things with your hands." Her expression grew mischievous. "That you cannot cook Russian food to save your life, but you try very hard," Mason laughed, acknowledging the truth in her gentle teasing. His attempts at borscht had been disastrous, though Elena had eaten it anyway, praising his effort while tactfully suggesting modifications. "I told him the most important thing," she continued more seriously, "that you see me, not just Russian, bride or foreign woman, but Elena, person with thoughts, dreams, capabilities." Her eyes met his. "This is rare gift to be truly seen." The morning of the wedding dawned clear and cooler, the heat wave finally broken by a front that had moved through overnight. Mason woke early, an inexplicable nervousness fluttering in his stomach despite the certainty of his decision. Elena had spent the night at Dorothy's house, a concession to the one American wedding tradition she'd insisted on observing, the groom not seeing the bride before the ceremony. Tom arrived at 9, carrying his suit in a garment bag and a bottle of 18-year-old scotch. "Little early for this," he said, placing the bottle on the kitchen counter, "but I figured we might need a drop to steady the nerves." They shared a modest toast as they dressed, Tom straightening Mason's tie with brotherly concern. "You know," Tom said, stepping back to assess his handiwork, "I've never seen you this happy." Not since Sarah," Mason finished for him. "I know." Tom nodded, his expression serious. "She would approve, Mason, of Eleanor, of you moving forward. Sarah never wanted anyone to stop living on her account, least of all you." The simple words, spoken by the friend who had known both Mason and Sarah since childhood, unleashed a wave of emotion that caught Mason off guard. He turned away, blinking rapidly, adjusting his cuffs unnecessarily. "Thanks, Tom. That means a lot." They arrived at the courthouse 30 minutes early, Mason pacing the hallway while Tom chatted with the clerk about fishing spots along the Umpqua River. Robert and Barbara Anderson appeared precisely at 10:30, Barbara wearing a blue dress and a cautious smile, Robert extending a firm handshake to Mason. "You look good, son," Robert said, his gruff tone belying the emotion in his eyes. "Ready for this?" "More than ready," Mason replied honestly. At precisely 11 o'clock, Elena arrived with Dorothy, who had appointed herself bride's attendant with characteristic enthusiasm. The moment Elena stepped into the courthouse foyer, everything else faded from Mason's awareness. Her dress was simple but elegant, her dark hair arranged in a loose updo with tiny white flowers woven through it. But it was her expression, serene, joyful, absolutely certain. That took Mason's breath away. The ceremony itself was brief, the county judge efficient, but kind as she led them through their vows. Mason had worried that the institutional setting might feel cold or impersonal, but with Elena's hands warm in his and their small circle of supporters around them, the moment held all the gravity and joy he could have wished for. "By the authority vested in me by the state of Oregon," the judge concluded, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." As their lips met, Mason heard Dorothy's delighted applause and Tom's good-natured whistle. When they turned to face their guests, Barbara Anderson was wiping away tears, and even Robert looked suspiciously misty-eyed. The reception at their home was a simple affair, a luncheon on the back patio, with food prepared by Dorothy and her niece who worked at the diner. Jack Blackwell had arranged flowers from the nursery in terracotta pots around the yard, and Frank Miller surprised everyone by revealing a talent for photography, documenting the celebration with his expensive camera. As the afternoon progressed, more townspeople stopped by. The postman and his wife, Mason's colleagues from the building inspection office, 3 of Elena's co-workers from the nursery. Even Meredith Wilson made a brief appearance, presenting them with a first edition of Chekhov's short stories that she'd ordered specially from a book dealer in Portland. "I thought you might appreciate something from your homeland," she told Elena stiffly, clearly uncomfortable but making an effort. "The translations are supposed to be excellent." Elena accepted the gift with genuine gratitude. "This is a thoughtful gift. Perhaps we can start a book club at the library someday and share Russian literature with the community." Meredith blinked, clearly not having expected this response. "That's not a bad idea, actually. We've been trying to increase adult programming." By evening, as the last guests departed, Mason and Eleanor sat alone on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in streaks of gold and crimson. Eleanor had changed from her wedding dress into a simple sundress, her hair now loose around her shoulders. She leaned against Mason's side, a contented weariness in her posture. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "Yes," she replied simply. "Everything today was perfect, small but meaningful, like a seed that grows into something larger." In the weeks that followed, they settled into life as a married couple, the adjustment surprisingly seamless after their months of living together. They filed the necessary paperwork to begin Elena's permanent residency process, met with an immigration lawyer in Eugene who assured them that their case was straightforward, and began planning improvements to the house, a proper greenhouse. For Elena's gardening projects, an expansion of Mason's workshop. At the nursery, Elena's school program took shape, with the first class of 3rd graders scheduled to visit in September. Jack had cleared a section of the property for educational demonstrations, and Elena spent hours developing lesson plans that would engage young children while teaching them fundamental concepts about plant biology and sustainability. Mason watched her bloom in this role, her initial hesitancy about her English abilities giving way to confidence as she practiced her presentations with him each evening. The teacher she had been in Russia re-emerged, adaptable and creative in this new context. September brought cooler weather and the start of the school year. Elena's first-class visit to the nursery was deemed a tremendous success, with the elementary school principal requesting additional sessions for other grades. Word spread quickly, and soon Elena was fielding requests from the neighboring town's school district as well. "You've become quite the local celebrity," Mason teased one evening as Elena reviewed feedback forms from teachers. She glanced up, a pencil tucked behind her ear. Not a celebrity, just doing work I love. But her pleased smile betrayed her satisfaction. Children here are the same as children in Russia. Curious, full of energy, wanting to understand the world around them. October arrived with brilliant foliage and the first real test of their marriage. Elena's application for permanent residency had hit an unexpected snag, a request for additional documentation and a rescheduled interview in Portland, months earlier than they'd anticipated. Their immigration lawyer assured them it was routine, but the stress of gathering the required materials and preparing for intense scrutiny of their relationship took its toll. "What if they do not believe us?" Elena asked late one night, her voice small in the darkness of their bedroom. "What if they think, like Mrs. Henderson, that our marriage is arrangement, not real?" Mason pulled her closer, feeling the tension in her shoulders. "Our marriage is as real as anyone's, Elena. More real than many. We have friends who will vouch for us, photos, joint accounts. We've done everything by the book." "I know, but still I worry." She shifted to face him. "If they deny my application, I would have to leave. Go back to Russia while we appeal." The thought sent a chill through Mason. "That's not going to happen," he said with more confidence than he felt. "But even if it did, we would figure it out. I'd go with you if necessary. We're in this together now." The morning of the interview, they drove to Portland in tense silence, a thick folder of documentation between them on the truck's bench seat. Elena wore a conservative blue dress and low heels, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Mason had opted for a suit, though he'd loosened his tie twice already out of nervous habit. The immigration office was a nondescript government building with institutional beige walls and uncomfortable plastic chairs. They arrived 30 minutes early, as instructed, and waited among other couples and families, all radiating similar anxiety. "Reed?" A stern-looking woman in a navy pantsuit appeared in the doorway, clipboard in hand. "Mason and Elena Reed?" The interview room was small and windowless, with a desk, 3 chairs, and a conspicuous video camera in the corner. The immigration officer, Ms. Patel, according to her nameplate, reviewed their file in silence for several excruciating minutes before looking up. "You met through an international matchmaking service," she stated, her tone neutral. "Yes," Mason confirmed. "We corresponded for 18 months before Elena came to the United States on a visitor visa." Ms. Patel nodded, making a note. "And you were married 3 months after Ms. Sorokina's arrival?" "Yes," Elena answered. "We had an agreement to live together first, to be sure we were compatible before marriage." What followed was 2 hours of increasingly personal questions about their daily routines, their families, their future plans. They were asked about Mason's previous marriage, about Elena's brother in Canada, about why they'd chosen a courthouse wedding. At one point, they were separated and questioned individually, asked to describe their home, their first meeting, their courtship. By the time they were reunited in the interview room, Mason's collar felt like it was choking him, and Elena's composed facade had developed small cracks, a tremor in her hands, a tightness around her mouth. Ms. Patel reviewed her notes one final time, her expression unreadable. Then, to Mason's surprise, she smiled slightly. "Your documentation is in order, and your accounts are consistent," she said. "I see no red flags in your application. The committee will make the final determination, but I'll be recommending approval of your petition." The relief was so intense that Mason felt momentarily lightheaded. Beside him, Elena exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping from their tense position. Outside, in the weak October sunshine, they stood on the sidewalk, still processing the outcome. Elena's composure finally broke, tears spilling down her cheeks as Mason pulled her into a tight embrace. "It's over," he murmured into her hair. "The worst part is over." "Not over," she corrected, wiping her eyes. Just beginning. But now we can begin without this shadow hanging over us. That night, they stayed in Portland, treating themselves to dinner at a nice restaurant and a room at a hotel with a view of the Willamette River. As they sipped wine and watched the city lights reflect on the water, Elena grew contemplative. "Today made me think about what is home," she said. "For a long time after my parents died, I did not feel at home anywhere. Even in the apartment where I grew up, something was missing." Mason nodded, understanding. After Sarah's death, his house had felt similarly hollow, a shell containing memories but lacking presence. "When I first came to Pinecrest," Elena continued, "I thought maybe I make mistake. Town's so small, people are so suspicious of outsiders. But now," she smiled, touching Mason's hand, "now I cannot imagine living anywhere else. Funny how the place becomes home because of people in it. Does it still feel foreign to you sometimes?" "America, I mean." Elena considered this. "Less each day. There are still moments, words I do not know, customs that seem strange, but these things become less important." She looked at him with quiet certainty. "Home is not about familiar language or customs. Home is where you plant your garden, where your roots grow deep." When they returned to Pinecrest the following day, they found an unexpected visitor waiting on their porch, Mikhail Sorokin, Elena's brother, his rental car parked in their driveway. Elena's cry of delight as she recognized him echoed across the yard. They embraced, rapid Russian flowing between them as Mason watched, smiling at the family resemblance, the same intelligent eyes, the same expressive hands as they talked. "Mason!" Elena turned to him, glowing with happiness. "This is my brother Mikhail. He surprised us." Mikhail stepped forward, extending his hand. He was taller than his sister, with the same dark hair but a more angular face. "Mason Reed," he said in accented but clear English. "At last we met. Elena writes so much about you, I feel I know you already." "It's great to meet you too," Mason replied warmly. "But how did you... I thought you couldn't get away from work." Mikhail grinned, resembling his sister even more when he smiled. "Emergency vacation. When Elena wrote about the residence interview, I thought, this is an important moment for my sister. I should be there. But flight delays, I missed the big day." He shrugged apologetically. "So now I am here for 1 week instead." Having Mikhail in their home brought a new dimension to Mason's understanding of his wife. He watched the siblings together, their inside jokes, their shared memories, the shorthand communication of people who had weathered tragedy together. Elena was more animated than he'd ever seen her, her English occasionally abandoned in favor of rapid Russian when emotion or complexity demanded it. Mikhail, for his part, was an engaging guest, curious about Mason's furniture making, enthusiastic about exploring Pinecrest and the surrounding countryside, determined to meet the people who had become part of his sister's new life. "Your brother approves. Of me, I think," Mason commented to Elena after Mikhail had gone to bed on his 3rd night with them. Elena smiled, curling against Mason's side on the sofa. "Very much so. He says you have kind eyes and strong hands. In Russian estimation, this is high praise." "And what did you tell him about me?" Mason asked, curious about the private conversations he'd heard but couldn't understand. "I told him that you are the man who saw me when I was invisible," Elena said simply. "Man who gave me space to grow, to become myself in a new country." She reached up, touching his face with gentle fingers. "I told him you are home I did not know I was looking for." Mikhail's visit coincided with the town's annual harvest festival, a weekend of activities centered around the town square. Despite initial hesitation, Elena had volunteered to run a booth, teaching children about seed saving and winter gardening. Mason watched with pride as she engaged with Pinecrest's youngest citizens, her initial self-consciousness about her accent long. Gone, as she helped small hands collect seeds from dried sunflower heads and label envelopes for storage. "Your wife is a natural teacher," Mikhail observed as they watched from a nearby bench. "In Russia, she was same way, always most popular teacher in school. Children sense who truly cares about them." "She's amazing," Mason agreed. "Did you know the elementary school offered her a part-time position as a teaching assistant for the spring semester? The principal was impressed with her work at the nursery." Mikhail nodded, unsurprised. "Elena always finds her place, wherever she goes. This is her gift." He turned to Mason, his expression growing serious. "When she first told me about matchmaking service, about coming to America to meet a stranger, I was terrified for her. Tried to talk her out of it, offered her a place with me in Toronto instead." "She mentioned that," Mason said. "I've sometimes wondered why she chose this path instead. It must have seemed so uncertain." For Elena, moving to Toronto would have been a safe choice, but not her own choice. All her life she put others first, our parents, then me. Coming here was the first thing she did purely for herself. Mikhail smiled slightly. "She is stubborn, my sister. Once she makes a decision, nothing will change her mind." "I've noticed," Mason said with a laugh. "She's been trying to convince me to expand the garden next spring. I think she wants to take over the entire backyard." "Let her," Mikhail advised. "Elena's gardens always produce more than seems possible from small space. In Russia, our neighbors called her plot Miracle Garden because she grew so much food from few square meters." As they talked, Mason spotted Greta Henderson across the square, watching Elena's booth with an unreadable expression. She hadn't spoken to either of them since the incident at the nursery, but neither had she continued her campaign against them. The town's clear support for the couple seemed to have tempered her public hostility, though Mason doubted her private opinions had changed. To his surprise, Greta made her way toward Eleanor's booth, where the activity had momentarily quieted as the children moved on to the face-painting station next door. Mason tensed, ready to intervene, but Mikhail placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Wait," he said quietly. "Let Elena handle this." From their position, they couldn't hear the conversation, but they could see Elena's initially wary expression, followed by Greta's stiff, formal gestures. After several minutes, Greta handed Elena something small, a book or pamphlet. Mason couldn't tell from the distance, before walking away, her posture rigid. When they joined Elena afterward, she showed them what Greta had given her, a church cookbook with a recipe for Russian tea cakes circled in pencil and a brief note that read simply, "The Ladies' Auxiliary is collecting recipes for international. Desserts for the Christmas Bazaar. Deadline November 15th. Not exactly an apology," Mason observed. "No," Elena agreed, "but maybe tiny olive branch. First step." Mikhail stayed for the remainder of the festival, helping them pack up Elena's booth on Sunday afternoon as the event wound down. His flight back to Toronto was scheduled for early Monday morning, requiring a pre-dawn drive to Eugene's airport. As they said their goodbyes in the chilly darkness of their driveway, Mikhail embraced his sister tightly, whispering something in Russian that made her smile through her tears. Then he turned to Mason, gripping his hand firmly. "Take care of each other," he said simply, "and know you always have family in Canada if you need anything." "Thank you," Mason replied, meaning it deeply. "And you're always welcome here. Any time." As Mikhail's rental car disappeared down the driveway, Elena leaned against Mason in the early morning stillness, neither of them ready to go back inside just yet. "What did he whisper to you?" Mason asked. At the end, Elena's smile was soft in the fading moonlight. He said, "You found your garden, little sister. Now watch how it grows." Above them, the stars were fading as the eastern sky lightened with the promise of dawn. The air smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys, the first real scent of autumn. In a few hours, Eleanor would go to the nursery, and Mason would begin his inspections for the day. Life would resume its normal rhythm. But as they stood together in the growing light, Mason felt anything but ordinary. The journey that had begun with a hesitant letter to a woman he knew only through a photograph had led him here, to a love that had survived doubt and prejudice, to a partnership built on respect and understanding, to a home that finally felt complete. In Moscow, Mikhail would soon be landing, carrying stories of his sister's new life back to Russia. In Pinecrest, the town would continue its slow evolution, its gradual acceptance of the unexpected couple in the craftsman house on the edge of town. And in their garden, the seeds Elena had planted would lie dormant through the winter, gathering strength beneath the frost, waiting for spring to reveal what they would become. "We should go in," Mason said finally, feeling the chill of the morning air. "It's getting cold out here." Elena nodded, but her gaze remained on the lightening horizon, on the mountains emerging from shadow as the sun prepared to rise. "Yes," she agreed, taking his hand. "Let's go home." 5 years passed in the rhythms of small-town life, seasons changing, gardens growing, relationships deepening like tree roots seeking water. Elena's permanent residency had been approved without further complications, and last spring she had proudly taken the oath as a United States citizen. Mason and half the town watching with misty eyes as she raised her right hand in the Portland Federal Building. The craftsman house on the edge of Pinecrest had transformed during those years. Mason had built the greenhouse he'd promised Elena, a beautiful structure of wood and glass that stood adjacent to what was now a sprawling garden. What had once been a simple backyard now featured raised beds of vegetables, a small orchard of dwarf fruit trees, berry bushes along the fence line, and a dedicated section for teaching local children about sustainable gardening. Elena herself had changed, not in essentials, but in presence. The hesitant, watchful woman who had stepped off the Greyhound bus now moved through town with confidence, greeted by name at the grocery store, the post office, the library. Her English had improved to near fluent, though the Russian accent remained, becoming as much a part of her identity in Pinecrest as her legendary tomatoes and the gardening column she now wrote for the weekly newspaper. Mason watched these transformations with pride and occasionally wonder. On this particular Sunday afternoon in late April, he observed from the kitchen window as Elena conducted a gardening workshop for a mix of adults and children in their backyard. The spring sun highlighted the few strands of silver now appearing in her dark hair as she demonstrated proper transplanting techniques, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. "Roots need space to breathe," she was explaining to a rapt audience. "Too crowded, they compete for nutrients. Like people, plants need the right environment to thrive." The doorbell interrupted Mason's observations. He opened the front door to find Barbara Anderson on the porch, holding a ceramic dish covered with foil. "Barbara, what a surprise! Come in." Mason stepped back, welcoming her inside. "We weren't expecting you until next weekend." Barbara handed him the dish, apple cobbler by the smell of it, and followed him into the house. "Robert's fishing with his brother in Bend, so I thought I'd come early. Hope that's all right." "Of course. Elena's just finishing up her gardening class in the backyard. Can I get you some coffee?" As Mason prepared coffee in the kitchen, Barbara wandered the living room, noting the changes since her last visit 6 months ago. The space had evolved over the years to reflect both its occupants, Mason's handcrafted furniture alongside touches of Elena's Russian heritage. A hand-embroidered wall hanging from Elena's grandmother shared space with a landscape painting by a local Oregon artist. Photographs documented their life together, Elena becoming a citizen, Mason receiving an award for his furniture design, the two of them standing proudly beside Mikhail at his wedding in Toronto 2 years earlier. "You've painted," Barbara observed when Mason returned with coffee. "The blue is lovely, brightens the whole room." "Elena's idea," Mason replied, setting down the mugs. "Said the old color made the winters feel longer." Barbara smiled, settling into an armchair. "She's good for you, Mason. I don't think I've properly told you that." Before Mason could respond, the back door opened and voices filled the kitchen. Eleanor, thanking her students, arranging next month's class, saying goodbye. A moment later she appeared in the living room doorway, cheeks flushed from the sun, dirt smudged on one knee of her jeans. "Barbara!" Eleanor's surprise quickly transformed to delight. "We did not expect you until next week." The two women embraced, their initial wariness from years ago having evolved into genuine affection. Barbara held Elena at arm's length, examining her with a mother's eye. "You're looking thin. Are you eating enough?" Elena laughed, exchanging an amused glance with Mason. "I eat plenty. Running around with students keeps me active, that's all." As the three caught up over coffee and cobbler, Mason marveled at the ease between the women who had once regarded each other with such caution. Barbara now visited several times a year, sometimes with Robert, sometimes alone. She had become an unexpected ally in Elena's community garden initiative, using her connections in Portland to secure grants and donations of equipment. "How's the expansion coming along?" Barbara asked, referring to the community garden project that had taken over the vacant lot behind the elementary school. Elena's eyes lit up, as they always did when discussing her passion project. "We broke ground last week. Town Council finally approved the irrigation system, and the high school woodworking class is building raised beds as a service project." "The whole town's involved now," Mason added. Even Greta Henderson donated seed packets from her church group. The mention of Greta no longer carried the tension it once had. Over the years, the woman's frosty disapproval had thawed incrementally. First the cookbook invitation, then occasional civil nods at community events, eventually evolving to cautious participation in Elena's gardening initiatives. Never friendship, but a détente that allowed both women to coexist in the small community. After finishing her coffee, Barbara insisted on helping Elena clean up from the gardening class. Mason excused himself to work in his shop, leaving the women to talk privately, as they often preferred to do. His workshop, once confined to the basement, now occupied a dedicated building behind the house, a spacious structure filled with tools, wood, and projects in various stages of completion. What had begun as a hobby had evolved into a reputable small business. Mason's custom furniture was now sought after throughout the region, featured in several design magazines, and showcased in a gallery in Portland. He maintained his position as Pinecrest's building inspector, but reduced his hours to 4 days a week, devoting Fridays to his woodworking. He was sanding the edges of a cherry dining table when Elena appeared in the doorway, arms crossed against the spring chill. "Barbara is settling into the guest room," she said, entering the warmth of the workshop. "She brought photos of Sarah's cousin's new baby." Mason nodded, brushing sawdust from the table's surface. "Nice of her to come early. I know you enjoy her visits." Elena moved beside him, running her fingers along the table's smooth edge. "She asked if we might visit Portland next month, stay with them for a long weekend." "Sounds good to me. Any particular reason?" A smile played at the corners of Elena's mouth. "She wants to introduce us to fertility specialists. Her friend's daughter had success there after trying for several years." Mason set down his sandpaper, turning to face his wife fully. They had been trying to conceive for nearly 2 years now, without success. Initially, they hadn't worried. Eleanor was 37 when they started trying, still within the range of normal fertility. But as months passed without news, Eleanor had grown increasingly quiet on the subject. "Are you comfortable with that?" he asked carefully. "Seeing a specialist?" Elena sighed, leaning against his workbench. In Russia, there is hesitation about such things. Old superstitions, perhaps. But I am not getting younger, Mason. If medical science can help us, why not try? Mason wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. Whatever you want to do, I'm with you. No pressure either way. Elena nodded against his chest. After a moment, she pulled back, her expression shifting to something more practical. Barbara also mentioned that Robert might have a job offer for you. Oh? This was news to Mason. What kind of job? Custom furniture for a new hotel in Portland. Very exclusive, very expensive. They want local craftsmen, sustainable materials. Elena's pride in her husband was evident. Barbara showed developers your website. They were impressed. That evening, the three of them sat on the porch after dinner, wrapped in light blankets against the cooling air. Barbara shared stories of Portland's changing neighborhoods, the restaurant scene, the plans for the new hotel that might feature Mason's work. Elena spoke about her upcoming teaching assistant position at the elementary school, an arrangement that would complement her work at the nursery during the summer months. You've built quite a life here, Barbara observed as the conversation lulled. Both of you. Mason followed her gaze across their property, the workshop illuminated by a single light, where he'd returned to work briefly after dinner, the greenhouse, where seedlings waited for warmer weather, the garden beds prepared for summer planting. It's more than I ever imagined, he acknowledged, especially after Sarah died. I thought this house would always feel incomplete somehow. Barbara's eyes grew soft in the fading light. Sarah would be happy, seeing you like this. Both of you. She reached over to squeeze Elena's hand. She never wanted anyone to stop living because she had to. Later, after Barbara had gone to bed, Mason found Elena in the greenhouse, checking on tomato seedlings that would eventually be distributed to her community garden students. The space was warm and humid, alive with the smell of growth and possibility. Penny. And for your thoughts, he said, coming to stand beside her. Elena looked up from the seedling trays, her expression thoughtful. I was thinking about time, how it changes things so gradually we do not notice until we look back. 5 years since you stepped off that bus, Mason mused. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. Elena carefully repositioned a seedling that had started to lean. When I first came to Pinecrest, I thought perhaps I made a terrible mistake. So much suspicion, so much loneliness. You nearly left, Mason remembered. When Mikhail offered you the place in Toronto. Yes. Elena straightened, wiping her hands on her gardening apron. But leaving would have been an easy path. Staying, putting down roots. This was harder, but worth every difficult moment. The phrase, putting down roots, had become something of a mantra between them over the years, a shorthand for commitment, for choosing to nurture a relationship even when conditions weren't ideal. Are you happy with your choice? Mason asked, though he knew the answer. No regrets? Elena's smile in the greenhouse's soft light was answer enough, but she spoke anyway. The only regret would be giving up before seeing what could grow here. She gestured to the seedlings around them. Like these plants, they look so fragile now, but with care, patience, right conditions. By August, they feed the whole community. The following morning, Elena left early for the nursery, where the spring rush kept the entire staff busy from dawn until closing. Barbara insisted on helping Mason with breakfast cleanup before announcing her plan to explore downtown Pinecrest on her own. The new bookstore Elena mentioned, I thought I'd check it out, maybe have lunch at that cafe on Main Street. Mason nodded, amused at the idea of Pinecrest having enough attractions to occupy a visitor for a morning. You remember how to get downtown? It's just 4 blocks that way, Barbara finished for him, pointing. I may be getting older, Mason, but my memory's intact. I'll be back by 2 for that property showing. The property showing had been arranged somewhat last minute. A parcel of land adjacent to theirs had come on the market, 5 acres with a small stream running through it. Mason and Elena had discussed expanding their property for years, particularly as Elena's gardening initiatives grew more ambitious. The timing seemed right, with their finances stable and the land priced reasonably. At precisely 2 o'clock, the real estate agent, Diane Collins, a recent transplant to Pinecrest, pulled into their driveway. Barbara returned from her downtown excursion moments later, and the 3 of them followed Diane's car down a gravel access road that bordered Mason and Eleanor's existing property. The land was beautiful, mixed forest with several natural clearings, the small stream creating a pleasant background music as it wound through the property. Diane led them to a ridge overlooking the stream, where the view opened up to the mountains beyond. The previous owner had planned to build here, she explained, indicating the partially cleared area. All the environmental surveys are already complete, and there's preliminary approval for a residential structure. Mason walked the perimeter, envisioning possibilities. Elena had spoken of expanding the garden, perhaps adding beehives, maybe even a small educational center where she could host workshops regardless of weather. The land would allow all of that and more. "What do you think?" he asked Barbara, who was examining a cluster of wild trillium growing near the stream. "It's gorgeous," she replied. "Reminds me of where Robert proposed all those years ago. Similar feeling, peaceful, removed from the world, but not isolated." As they continued exploring the property, Mason's phone rang. Elena, calling from the nursery. "How is it?" she asked without preamble, her voice eager despite the background noise of customers. "Even better than we expected," Mason told her, wandering toward the stream to hear better. "The clearing by the stream would be perfect for what you wanted to do with the educational garden." "Take many photos," Eleanor instructed. "I can come. See tomorrow morning before work, but I want to see everything tonight too." Mason promised plenty of documentation and ended the call, turning to find Barbara watching him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. Something between happiness and nostalgia, with perhaps a hint of melancholy. "You too," she said, shaking her head slightly. "The way you build things together, it's special." After thoroughly exploring the property and taking dozens of photographs, they thanked Diane and arranged for Elena to view the land the following day. On the drive home, Barbara was unusually quiet, looking out the window at the passing landscape with a pensive expression. "Everything okay?" Mason asked as they turned onto their street. Barbara nodded, then hesitated. "I was just thinking about choices. The ones we make, the ones made for us." She turned to face him. "When Sarah died, all of us were broken. You, me, Robert. For years I thought nothing would ever feel right again." Mason waited, sensing there was more she needed to say. "I'm worried about you staying in Pinecrest," Barbara continued. "Thought it was unhealthy somehow, that you were clinging to memories instead of moving forward." Her smile was self-deprecating. "I was wrong about that, and about many other things." That evening, Elena returned from work exhausted but eager to see the photos of the property. The 3 of them gathered around the kitchen table, Mason's laptop open to the gallery of images he'd taken. Elena studied each one with careful attention, asking questions about the soil quality, the sun exposure in different areas, the depth of the stream. "It's perfect," she concluded finally, sitting back in her chair. "Exactly what we've been looking for." "We should sleep on it," Mason suggested, ever practical. "It's a big decision." Eleanor nodded, but her eyes returned to the screen, to the image of the clearing by the stream. "Yes, of course, but I think we both know what we want to do." Barbara excused herself to make a phone call to Robert, leaving them alone in the kitchen. Once she was gone, Elena turned to Mason, her expression suddenly serious. "I have news," she said quietly. "I was going to wait until Barbara left to tell you, but I don't think I can wait that long." Mason felt his heart rate increase, something in her tone triggering both hope and anxiety. "What is it?" Eleanor took his hand, placing it against her abdomen, her eyes never leaving his. "I took a test this morning, and again at lunch break too." Be sure, for a moment Mason couldn't process what she was saying. Then understanding dawned, sending a wave of emotion so intense he couldn't speak. "We're having a baby," he finally managed, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena nodded, tears gathering in her eyes. "Doctor says I'm about 8 weeks along. Everything looks normal so far." The timing was almost poetic. New life, new land, new beginnings all converging at once. Mason pulled Elena into his arms, burying his face in her hair, overwhelmed by gratitude and joy. "The property," he said when he could trust his voice again. "Are you sure it's not too much to take on right now?" Eleanor pulled back, her expression radiant despite her exhaustion. "It is perfect timing. We will need space for our growing family, yes? The child should have room to explore, to learn about nature." The practicalities would need to be addressed: financing the land purchase, planning for Eleanor's maternity leave, adapting their schedules once the baby arrived. But in that moment, sitting in their kitchen with photographic evidence of possibility spread before them, those details seemed manageable, even exciting. "Should we tell Barbara?" Mason asked. Elena considered this. "Perhaps tomorrow before she leaves. Let us have this news to ourselves for one night." Later, after Barbara had gone to bed and the house was quiet, Mason and Elena sat on the porch swing, a blanket wrapped around them against the cool spring night. The moon was nearly full, illuminating the garden, the greenhouse, the workshop, all. The physical manifestations of the life they'd built together. "I never expected any of this," Mason said softly, his hand resting on Elena's still flat stomach. "When I sent that first letter to you, I was just hoping for companionship, someone to share this house with. And I was looking for a new beginning," Elena replied. "Chance to define myself, not just as sister or daughter or teacher from a small Russian town." She placed her hand over his. "We both found more than we were looking for." The night was peaceful. The only sounds were the creak of the porch swing and the distant hooting of an owl in the woods. In a few hours, Elena would view the property that might become part of their expanded home. In a few months, they would share the news of the baby with their friends in Pinecrest, with Mikhail in Toronto, with the wider community that had gradually accepted them as an integral part of the town's fabric. In less than a year, a new life would join theirs, bringing its own changes and challenges. But for now, it was enough to sit together in the moonlight, surrounded by the evidence of what patience and care could create: a garden from bare soil, a business from a hobby, a community from individual connections, a family from two people who had taken the risk of trusting a stranger. "We should sleep," Elena finally said, though she made no move to rise. "Early morning tomorrow." Mason nodded, equally reluctant to end the moment. Just a few more minutes. Above them, stars pierced the clear Oregon sky, the same stars that shone over Russia, over Toronto, over every place where people searched for connection and meaning. The same stars that had witnessed Elena's journey from St. Petersburg to this porch, and Mason's journey from grief to renewed purpose. In the garden, beneath the soil warmed by day and cooled by night, seeds planted weeks earlier were stirring, sending tentative roots into the earth, preparing to reach for the sun. In the greenhouse, seedlings that would feed their community stood in neat rows, each one a testament to Elena's belief that small beginnings could yield abundant harvests. And between two people on a porch swing, in the space created by patience, and understanding. The seed of a new life had taken root, already growing according to its own perfect design, already changing them in ways they had yet to discover. Yes, Eleanor agreed, settling more comfortably against Mason's side. A few more minutes. The swing creaked gently as they rocked, keeping time with the rhythm of their breath, of their shared life, of the story they continued to write together. A story that had begun with a letter and a photograph, with a woman stepping off a bus into uncertainty, with a man recognizing the quiet fire in her silence. A story that, like the garden they tended, grew more bountiful with each passing season. 7 years had passed since Elena first learned she was pregnant. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, she stood at the edge of what the locals had come to call the Russian garden. 3 acres of the expanded property transformed into an educational center that drew visitors from across the state. Beside her, 6-year-old Natalia Reed carefully labeled seed packets with precise handwriting that mirrored her mother's. "Mama, is this right?" Natalia held up a packet for inspection, her dark hair, so like Elena's, escaping from its braid. Elena examined the label. "Perfect. Your handwriting is becoming very beautiful." Pride bloomed across Natalia's face. She had inherited her mother's methodical nature and her father's creative hands, a combination that made her both a thoughtful student and an intuitive gardener, despite her young age. From the adjacent workshop came the sound of hammering, followed by a child's delighted laughter. Elena smiled, knowing without looking that Mason was helping their 4-year-old son Daniel with one of their special projects, simple woodworking tasks designed for small hands under careful supervision. The educational center had been Elena's vision, realized through years of determined effort. What had begun as informal classes in their backyard had evolved into a structured program with regular workshops, school field trips, and a summer camp focusing on sustainable agriculture. The original property purchase had been followed by a successful grant application, allowing them to build the main teaching pavilion where Elena now conducted classes for both children and adults. The Community Garden Initiative had expanded beyond Pinecrest, with satellite gardens now established in 3 neighboring towns. Each summer, the harvests from these gardens supplied local food banks and a weekly farmers' market that had become a regional attraction. "Mrs. Reed?" The voice belonged to Amber Jensen, a college student who had once attended Elena's children's gardening classes and now worked part-time at the center. "The sustainable irrigation workshop starts in 20 minutes. We have 15 people signed up." Elena nodded, checking her watch. "Thank you, Amber. I'll be there shortly." As Amber walked away, Natalia looked up from her seed packets. "Can I help with the workshop, Mama? I remember how the rain barrels connect." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, helping her daughter gather the labeled seeds. "You can demonstrate for the little children." Natalia beamed, always eager to share her knowledge. At 6, she moved between English and Russian with ease, often serving as translator when Mikhail and his family visited from Toronto. Her bilingual abilities had made her something of a celebrity at Pinecrest Elementary, where the principal had recently established a language exchange program inspired by the success of Elena's gardening curriculum. They were heading toward the teaching pavilion when Mason and Daniel emerged from the workshop, both sporting sawdust in their hair. Daniel clutched a small wooden box, his face alight with accomplishment. "Mama, look what we made!" He raced toward Eleanor, nearly tripping in his excitement. "It's for my treasures." Elena knelt to examine the simple pine box, admiring the slightly wobbly lid and the carefully sanded edges. "This is beautiful craftsmanship, Daniel. You are becoming master woodworker like your father." Daniel puffed up at the praise, his blue eyes, Mason's eyes, sparkling. "Dad did the cutting, but I did the sanding and helped with the hinges." "Very impressive," Elena assured him, brushing sawdust from his fair hair. "Would you like to help?" Natalia and me with the irrigation workshop? You can show the children how to check the water levels. Daniel nodded enthusiastically, tucking his treasure box carefully under one arm. At 4, he was already a fixture at the center. Charming. Visitors with his earnest explanations of composting techniques and water conservation principles. Mason checked his watch. I need to head into town, meeting with the high school principal about expanding the apprenticeship program. He leaned down to kiss Elena goodbye, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder. Tom's bringing lunch by 4. The kids around noon. We'll be ready, Elena replied. Don't forget Barbara called this morning. She and Robert want to confirm Thanksgiving arrangements. Mason nodded, making a mental note to return the call. The Andersons had become fixtures at their holiday celebrations, often staying for a week or more in the guest cottage Mason had built on the new property. Robert, now fully retired, had found unexpected joy in helping with the center's maintenance, while Barbara code-taught cooking classes that incorporated the garden's harvests. As Mason drove toward town, he reflected on the transformation of their lives over the past 12 years. What had begun as an unconventional arrangement, a lonely man and a Russian mail-order bride taking a chance on each other, had blossomed into something neither could have imagined. A thriving family, a respected community center, professional success for them both. Elena had completed her teaching certification 3 years ago, dividing her time between the educational center and part-time work at Pinecrest Elementary. Mason's furniture business had grown steadily, his pieces now featured in galleries in Portland, Seattle, and San Francisco. They balanced their professional commitments with family life, each supporting the other's ventures while keeping their children at the center of their priorities. The high school appeared ahead, its brick facade recently renovated as part of a district-wide improvement project. Mason parked in the visitor's lot, gathering the portfolio he'd prepared for the meeting. The apprenticeship program had been his idea, a way to introduce interested students to fine woodworking while fulfilling their vocational requirements. What had started with a single student 4 years ago had expanded to 6 apprentices, 3 of whom had gone on to related careers after graduation. Principal Watkins greeted Mason in the main office, leading him toward the conference room where several teachers and the district's vocational coordinator waited. We're excited about possibly expanding the program, Watkins said as they walked. The feedback from students and parents has been overwhelmingly positive. The meeting proceeded smoothly, with Mason presenting his proposal for accommodating additional students and potentially adding a summer intensive option. The teachers asked thoughtful questions about scheduling and supervision, while the vocational coordinator expressed enthusiasm about potential grant funding. As the discussion wound down, the door opened and Greta Henderson appeared, a stack of files in her arms. Now in her 70s, she had retired from active church leadership but maintained her position on the school board with characteristic tenacity. Mr. Reed, she acknowledged Mason with a brisk nod. I understand you're proposing an expansion of the woodworking program. Though their relationship had evolved from outright hostility to cautious coexistence over the years, interactions with Greta still carried a certain tension. She had never fully embraced Elena's place in the community, though she had grudgingly acknowledged the value of the educational center after her own grandchildren began attending the summer programs. Yes, Mrs. Henderson, Mason replied evenly. We've had excellent results with the current apprentices, and there's growing interest among the students. Greta studied the proposal summary in front of her, lips pursed. The budget implications are significant. However, she paused, seemingly weighing her words. My grandson Jacob speaks highly of his experience in your workshop, says he's learned more practical mathematics there than in his regular classes. Coming from Greta, this was high praise indeed. Mason inclined his head, accepting the comment without overreacting. I'm glad to hear that. Jacob has a natural talent for spatial reasoning. The meeting concluded with provisional approval for the expansion pending final budget review. As Mason gathered his materials, Greta approached him, her expression unreadable. "Understand your wife's garden center is hosting the Thanksgiving community dinner this year," she said stiffly. "That's right," Mason confirmed. "It's become something of a tradition. Everyone's welcome." The annual dinner had begun 5 years ago, initially serving about 30 people from the community. Last year, over 100 had attended, including several families who had once been Elena's most vocal critics. Greta nodded, straightening her already immaculate blazer. "The Church Ladies' Auxiliary would like to contribute pies, 20 of them, if that would be helpful." The offer represented a significant gesture from a woman who had once led opposition to Elena's presence in Pinecrest. Mason recognized it as such, responding with appropriate gravity. "That would be very helpful, Mrs. Henderson. Elena will be grateful for the contribution." A hint of something, not quite a smile but a softening, crossed Greta's features. "We'll deliver them the day before. My granddaughter Lily would like to help serve if there's a place for her." "There's always room for more helpers," Mason assured her. "Natalia will be thrilled. She and Lily have become quite the friends in their ballet class." This was stretching the truth somewhat. The girls were classmates more than friends, but Mason believed in acknowledging attempts at reconciliation, however belated. Over the years, he'd learned that community, like marriage, required patient tending and the willingness to allow for growth and change. After the meeting, Mason drove to O'Malley's pub to meet Tom for lunch. The establishment had changed little. In the past decade, though ownership had passed to Dorothy's nephew after her retirement. The same scarred wooden tables, the same sports memorabilia on the walls, the same smell of beer and fried potatoes. Tom was already seated in their usual booth, reviewing contracts for his construction business on a tablet. At 49, his dark hair now threaded with silver, he had expanded his father's small operation into one of the region's most respected construction firms, specializing in eco-friendly building techniques. "How'd the school meeting go?" Tom asked as Mason slid into the booth. "Approved, pending final budget review. And you won't believe this. Greta Henderson offered church pies for the Thanksgiving dinner. 20 of them." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "No kidding, the Ice Queen finally melteth." "More like a slight thaw," Mason tempered. "But it's something." Their conversation shifted to business matters, upcoming projects, community events. Tom's wife, Carla, a wildlife biologist he'd met during a construction project at the state and park, was coordinating with Elena on a habitat restoration component for the summer camp curriculum. "Carla says Natalia's already memorized all the native bird species," Tom mentioned as their food arrived. "Kid's got an incredible memory." "Gets that from her mother," Mason said proudly. "Elena remembers every plant variety she's ever grown, every student she's ever taught." "Speaking of remarkable women," Tom leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. "I ran into Meredith Wilson at the library yesterday. She mentioned something about a grant application, said Elena might want to know about it." Meredith had retired as head librarian 2 years ago, but remained active on various community boards. Her relationship with Elena had evolved over the years from chilly disapproval to professional respect, especially after Natalia's birth, when Meredith had unexpectedly appeared on their doorstep with a collection of classic children's books, in both English and Russian, that she'd specially ordered. "I'll tell her," Mason promised. "She's been looking for funding to expand the accessibility features at the center. Wheelchair-friendly garden beds, sensory plants for visually impaired visitors." After lunch, Mason stopped by the hardware store, the grocery store, and finally the post office, where a package from Mikhail awaited, likely containing the Russian children's puppet theater he'd promised to send for Daniel's upcoming birthday. Mikhail and his family visited Oregon twice yearly, while Mason, Elena, and the children made an annual summer trip to Toronto. The cousins had formed close bonds despite the distance, united by their dual heritage and the stories Elena and Mikhail shared of their Russian childhood. It was mid-afternoon when Mason returned to the educational center, finding it buzzing with activity. A group of retirees was attending a fall planting workshop in the main pavilion, while homeschool students gathered near the greenhouse for a lesson on seed saving. Mason spotted Daniel near the small pond they'd installed last spring, earnestly explaining the water filtration system to two captivated grandparents. "He's been giving tours all afternoon," Amber informed Mason with an amused smile, appointed himself the official guide after the irrigation workshop ended. Mason watched his son's animated gestures, his careful pronunciation of technical terms, the serious expression so reminiscent of Elena when she was teaching. At 4, Daniel already displayed the confidence of a child who knew he was valued, his opinions respected, his contributions meaningful. Natalia appeared from the greenhouse, clipboard in hand, looking remarkably professional for a 6-year-old as she checked off items on what appeared to be an inventory list. She spotted Mason and waved, calling something to Amber before running to greet her father. "Dad, Mom said you had an important meeting. Did they say yes to more apprentices?" Her eyes, dark like Eleanor's, sparkled with curiosity. "Tentatively," Mason confirmed, kneeling to her level. "Where's your mom now?" "In the office with Ms. Wilson. They're talking about making the gardens more accessible for everyone." Natalia lowered her voice confidentially. "I think it's going to be expensive, but Mom says good things usually are." The office was a small, bright room attached to the main pavilion, filled with plant catalogs, curriculum materials, and children's artwork. Through the window, Mason could see Elena and Meredith Wilson bent over a laptop, deep in conversation. The sight of the two women, once adversaries, now collaborators, never failed to remind him of how far they'd all come. Rather than interrupting, he turned back to Natalia. "Want to help me unload the truck? Uncle Mikhail sent a package for Daniel's birthday." Natalia's eyes widened with delight. "The puppet theater. Can we hide it in the workshop? Daniel's been talking about it for weeks." Together, they carried the day's purchases to the house, a comfortable walk across a footbridge that spanned the small stream dividing the residential property from the educational center. The original Craftsman house had been expanded over the years, with a sunroom added to the southern exposure and a larger kitchen that accommodated family meals and informal gatherings. As they stored groceries, Natalia chattered about her day, the seeds she'd labeled, the irrigation system she'd helped demonstrate, the high school volunteers who were coming Saturday to help prepare the gardens for winter. "And Lily Henderson asked if I want to come to her birthday party next month," she added casually, reaching for a cookie from the jar on the counter. "It's at the skating rink. Can I go?" Mason paused, recognizing the significance of this invitation. Greta Henderson's granddaughter, extending friendship to Elena and Mason's daughter, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. "If you want to go, of course you can," he said carefully. "We'll need to find a nice present for Lily." "Mom says we could make her a terrarium," Natalia suggested. "Lily really liked the ones we made in summer camp." The sound of the front door opening announced Elena and Daniel's arrival, the boy's excited voice echoing through the house as he recounted his adventures as a tour guide. "And then I showed them how the biofilter works, and Mrs. Johnson said, I explained it better than the man who installed her pool." Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Dad, you're back. Did you bring ice cream?" "Hello to you too," Mason laughed, producing the requested treat from a grocery bag. "Sounds like you had quite the day." Elena followed, running a hand through her wind-tousled hair. A few more silver strands had appeared among the dark in recent years, especially after Daniel's birth. but her eyes remained as bright and perceptive as they had been on that first day at the bus station. "Meredith found a perfect grant opportunity," she told Mason, accepting the cup of tea he offered. "Deadline is tight, 3 weeks, but she offered to help with the application." "Tom mentioned she might have something." Mason nodded. "Sounds promising." As the children enjoyed their ice cream, Mason and Elena moved to the sunroom, where the late afternoon light streamed through windows overlooking the garden. This had become their favorite spot for quiet conversations, for planning, for simply being together amid the bustle of their increasingly full lives. Greta Henderson offered 20 pies for Thanksgiving, Mason mentioned, settling beside Elena on the cushioned bench. And Lily invited Natalia to her birthday party. Elena raised an eyebrow, understanding the significance. "Interesting. Perhaps seeing her grandchildren at our programs has finally, what is a phrase, broken the ice." "Something like that," Mason agreed. She even mentioned Jacob speaking highly of the apprenticeship program. Almost sounded like a compliment. Elena smiled, the expression softening the fine lines that had begun to appear around her eyes. "In Russia, we say, even the hardest winter eventually yields to spring. Greta Henderson has had a very long winter, I think." They sat in comfortable silence. For a moment, watching goldfinches gather at the feeder outside the window. From the kitchen came the sound of their children's laughter, Natalia explaining something to Daniel with the patience she'd inherited from her mother. "I never pictured this," Mason said softly. "Any of it. When I first wrote to you, I was just hoping to not be alone anymore." Elena nodded, understanding. "And I was looking for a new beginning, a chance to build a different life." Her hand found his fingers, intertwining with the familiarity of long practice. "We found so much more than we were seeking." Outside, the educational center stood as testament to their journey, from strangers brought together by a matchmaking service to partners in creating something meaningful for their community. The gardens that had begun as Elena's solitary refuge had become gathering places, classrooms, sources of nourishment, both literal and figurative, for hundreds of people. "Meredith asked an interesting question today," Elena said after a moment. "She wanted to know if we ever regretted how we met, if we wished we had found each other some other way." Mason turned to her, curious. "What did you tell her?" "I said no. Our beginning was unusual, yes, but it was honest. We both knew what we were looking for, what we were offering. No pretense." Elena's expression grew thoughtful. "And journey from that beginning to now, it shaped us, shaped what we built together." The sound of small feet thundering down the hallway announced the children's approach. A moment later, Daniel burst into the sunroom, a drawing clutched in his hand. "Look what I made. It's our family and the gardens and the workshop and everything." He thrust the paper toward them, face alight with creative pride. The drawing was a child's representation of their world, stick figures standing amid colorful blobs representing gardens, a lopsided rectangle for the workshop, squiggly lines for the stream. But the central image was unmistakable, 4 figures holding hands, standing together beside a house that radiated jagged yellow lines like sunbeams. "This is beautiful, Daniel," Elena praised, studying the artwork. "You've included everything important." "Not everything," Daniel corrected seriously. "I couldn't fit Uncle Mikhail and Aunt Sonia and the cousins, or Grandma and Grandpa Anderson, or Uncle Tom and Aunt Carla. There are too many people we love to fit on one page." The simple observation caught them both by surprise. This evidence that their children's world was so fundamentally different from the isolated existence Mason had known after Sarah's death, or the displaced uncertainty Eleanor had felt after losing her parents. "Maybe we need bigger paper," Mason suggested, pulling his son onto his lap. "Or maybe we can make a series of drawings, one for each part of our extended family." Natalia appeared in the doorway, Daniel's wooden treasure box in her hands. "I organized his special things while he was drawing," she explained. "The rocks and feathers are sorted by type now." "Thank you, Natalia," Elena acknowledged. "Very helpful. Now, who would like to help prepare dinner? Barbara and Robert will be calling during our meal to discuss Thanksgiving plans." As the family moved toward the kitchen, Elena lingered momentarily, her gaze drawn to the wall where Mason had hung a single photograph in a handcrafted cherry frame. The original picture from the matchmaking service catalogue, the one that had prompted his first letter. In it, a younger Elena stood stiffly against a plain backdrop, uncertainty in her eyes, her smile careful and restrained. Beside it hung another photograph, taken on their 10th wedding anniversary. In this image, Elena stood in the center of the Russian garden, surrounded by blooming plants, her head thrown back in laughter as Mason wrapped his arms around her from behind. Natalia and Daniel sat at their feet, their faces alight with the unself-conscious joy of children who had never known anything but love and belonging. The contrast between the two images told a story more eloquent than words, of a journey from isolation to connection, from caution to confidence, from arrangement to abiding love. A journey that had begun with a simple letter and a leap of faith, leading to a life neither of them could have imagined when they first stood face to face on that bus station platform 12 years ago. "Mom! Dad! Are you coming?" Natalia called. And from the kitchen, "Daniel's trying to add pepper to everything." Elena smiled, turning away from the photographs. "Yes, we're coming," she called back, her accent still present but softened by years of American life. "Tell your brother that not everything needs spice." As they joined their children in the kitchen, Daniel defending his culinary choices, Natalia organizing ingredients with methodical care, the last rays of autumn sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the scene with golden warmth. Outside, the gardens lay partially dormant, waiting for spring's renewal, while inside, the family they had created filled the house with movement and purpose and belonging. In this house that had once felt hollow with memories, now overflowing with present life. In this town that had once viewed a foreign bride with suspicion, now benefiting from her vision and perseverance. In this family forged not from conventional beginnings, but from the courage to see beyond appearances, to recognize the fire burning within another's silence, a fire that, given space and air and nurturing, had grown to warm not just two once lonely hearts, but an entire community. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.